Well, good morning. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the Middle Passage. I'd like to talk a little bit about slavery and some of the consequences, short term, long term. First of all, I think we know that slavery has existed for a very long time. I think we know that slavery has probably been around as long as humans. Historians will even say that slavery actually represented a step forward for humanity because when you defeated an enemy in war, you didn't kill them any longer. You just took them as captives, you took them as slaves. We know that the Roman Empire practiced slavery. Romans enslaved Romans and those conquered by the Roman armies. We know that the ancient Greeks practiced slavery. From the Greeks, we get from Aristotle the idea that there are two types of people. There are the people who were born or intended to be free, and there were people who were born or intended to be slaves. This comes from a Greek philosopher, Aristotle. We know that the Egyptians practiced slavery. We know that the Mesopotamians practiced slavery. And I can't even begin to imagine the horror that would be in people's minds and in their hearts when they were led away captive by their conquerors. What would become of us? Here, these strange people that are speaking a strange language, a foreign tongue that we do not understand. What are they saying? What are they doing? Why are they taking us? Where are we going? What sets African slavery, the slavery that was inflicted upon Africans by Europeans, starting in about the 1440s or 1450s. I believe that those folks felt the same horror as they were being taken. I think what further complicates it for those people, the Africans that were being led away captive, one, in many cases, they were sold by their own people. A Harvard sociologist 20 or 30 years ago, whose name escapes me currently, did a study on the effects of African slavery on West African tribal societies. Those societies that were the most affected initially by slavery. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, it was shown that Western African societies have a problem trusting. Well, it isn't too surprising if we consider that they had trouble trusting people that look like me. After all, we were the captives. So we earned that. There's no question. But what was the other interesting thing was even 500 or 600 years later, they had trouble trusting one another because it was your family that sold my family. It was your ancestors who profited by getting rid of my ancestors, and so on. And it's an interesting thing to think about the long-term effects and how important trust is to hold a civilization together. And yet, the European enslavement of Africans damaged for hundreds of years the ability to trust. Well, that's just one side note and one side effect, a big one nonetheless. The other thing that was interesting, now, if you think about it, yes, there would be horror anytime a person was taken captive. But in this case, not only did your captives speak a foreign tongue that you didn't understand, and you had no way of communicating with them, you had no way of understanding what they were saying, but adding to the horror, they didn't even look like you. These might be devils for all you know. And adding to the complication and the horror, you were then being taken onto a ship and out onto the water. Now where are we going? And to Africans, As to many ancient civilizations, there was a belief that their ancestors, the spirits of their ancestors, inhabited the land. So when you are leaving home, when you are leaving that land, you are leaving everything you know. You are leaving your ancestors. You are leaving their spirits. You are leaving their protection. You are leaving the right to be reunited with them in the afterworld or the afterlife. And that complication goes both ways. To the Europeans who needed to justify, by the way, some of what I'll share with you is coming from two different books that are wonderful, and I would recommend them to you if you are interested. The first one is this one. It's called Stamped from the Beginning, and the subtitle is The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And the author is an African studies professor from a university in Florida, Ibram Kendi, Ibram X. Kendi, K-E-N-D-I, who writes a marvelous and yet very painful story, as I mentioned. So let me just share with you a couple of thoughts from the people who were actually taking the slaves themselves. A aide of the Portuguese ruler Henry the Navigator, who was really kind of the mover and the shaker for Portuguese exploration of the New World. This aide, Zuara, Z-U-A-R-A, made a point to remind his readers that the chief riches of Prince Henry came from the 46 most valuable captives. And then he had to justify why it was okay for the Portuguese to take these Africans who did not look like them. Zuara basically reduced the captives, the Africans, to barbarians who desperately needed not only religious salvation, but also some sort of civilizing, a salvation from whatever civilization they incurred. And this is what Zuara writes, quote, "They lived like beasts without any custom of reasonable beings. What's more, they have no knowledge of bread or wine, and they were without covering or clothes or the lodgment of houses. And worse than all, they had no understanding of good, but only knew how to live in bestial sloth." And of course, one of the ongoing arguments that you will see throughout this course as we talk about slavery, because not only do we have to talk about slavery, but the slave owners themselves, the shippers, the captors, all had to somehow justify this barbaric practice. That frankly, by the time Africans are being enslaved, was a practice that was dying out in Europe. And so the Europeans felt compelled that they had to explain and they had to justify. And I do believe that it is those explanations, it is those justifications that frankly live with us today, still 500, 600 years later, and that form the basis or the bedrock of some of the horrific racial ideas that exist or persist down to the present time. Many of you have certainly felt its sting and have felt the consequences of some of these misplaced and horrific beliefs. But it starts here in the 1440s, as the Europeans felt compelled to justify what they were doing. The Middle Passage itself, the journey from Africa to essentially Latin America, Cuba, or the islands of the Caribbean, is even more horrific. And let me share with you, this comes from another wonderful book called American Colonies. And it was written by a man named Alan Taylor. And he talks not just about British America, but he talks about French Canada. He talks about the Spanish conquests of the New World. And that's why he uses the plural, American colonies. And he describes what the Middle Passage was really like. And so let me share a little very troubling quotes and facts with you. One school of thought amongst the shippers was loose packing. They argued that if you gave these people more room, little more room, better food, maybe some exercise, you had the chance of landing a more healthier and more profitable cargo. In other words, if you treated them better, they might live. The more people that lived, the more return on your investment you would receive. The most slave shippers, slavers, were considered tight packers, meaning we'll just cram everybody in to the bottom of this ship and hope for the best. And whomever survives, that's great for us. If they don't, oh well. On most ships, the slaves were jammed into dark holds and onto wooden shelves, not beds, wooden shelves that barely allowed room to turn over. The length of these shelves, 6 feet long by 16 inches wide and about 30 inches high. So from one shelf to the next, roughly 30 inches. If you measure your shoulder to your shoulder, I think you can see that you can get to 16 inches pretty quick. Not a lot of comfort, not a lot of room. And in fact, that measurement, the 30 inches between shelves, 6 feet long, 16 inches wide, was half of the space that was given to convicted convicts when they were being taken to other parts of the world. Lacking clothes and bedding, the slaves slept on these rough wooden shelves and in the wastes that their bodies produced overnight. The captain, or a captain of one of these ships, later recalled, quote, "The poor creatures, thus occupied and cramped, are likewise in irons for the most part, which makes it difficult for them to turn or move or attempt to rise or to lie down without hurting themselves or each other. Every morning," he wrote, "more instances than one are found of the living and the dead fastened together." Close quote. With good cause, the crew hated to go below deck. A ship's doctor later recalled, quote, "I was so overcome by the heat, the stench, and the foul air that I nearly fainted, and it was not without assistance that I could get upon deck." Close quote. I think we can at least say honestly, at least he was able to go up on deck and get fresh air. Incredible. And it goes on a little more. Of course, such ill-fed, abused, and despondent people were prone to sicken and die, especially because the slave ships were junctures for the world's diseases. Alada Equiano, one of the captive slaves who later on got his freedom and wrote an experience, a history of his life on the slave ship and as a slave. In fact, a lot of the primary source that we use about these descriptions came from him. He described his fellow slaves, quote, "as a multitude of black people of every description chained together, every one of their countenances expressing dejection and sorrow," close quote. The European crews exposed the slaves to smallpox, measles, gonorrhea, and syphilis. And the Africans brought along their own diseases in exchange with the crew: yellow fever, dengue fever, malaria, yaws, and especially a bacillary dysentery, a gastrointestinal disorder known as, quote, "the bloody flux." One surgeon described the effects, quote, "The floor of their rooms was so covered with blood and mucus that it resembled a slaughterhouse. It is not in the power of human imagination to picture to itself a situation more dreadful or disgusting," close quote. Deprived of their names, the dead bore the numbers assigned at shipment. For example, these types of records would be made. buried a slave number 84. This morning, buried a woman slave number 47. To discourage epidemics, some slave slavers threw overboard the first slave who fell sick. But you know what that ended up doing, frankly, was it encouraged more slaves to pretend to be sick. Imagine that they would prefer death by drowning than going into this new, strange place where who knew what would befall them, far away from the spirits of their ancestors. It is a most unpleasant thing that I wish we didn't have to know. I wish that this hadn't happened. I know that, unfortunately, we do need to talk about it because we need to know. We need to know the scars and the harm that has been done. And we need to know what the cost was to build the new world and to build what is now the United States. And this is multiplied many, many, many times over what it cost for each of us to live where and how we live today. A couple of thoughts before I sign off for the day. First is please look at the syllabus. Please make sure that you are aware of the various things coming up. The calendar, the last couple of pages of the syllabus will be very helpful. You'll see that there are some things going on this week and that will be due by the end of this weekend. So please do look at these things. I'd love to know what you think about some of the references that I used today, some of the stories, the quotes, and so forth. I'd love your questions. I'd love your comments. And also, don't forget, I'd love to meet with you. That's one of the requirements the first 3 weeks is to meet with all of you. So please reach out, set up a time. I'd love to get to know you. And other than that, I bid you farewell, and we'll be talking again soon. Bye.